All right, let's start this thing. So, our first session is entitled The Current State and the Future of Artificial Intelligence in Healthcare. To moderate and introduce the speakers, I invite Michael Costello to the stage. Mike is an associate teaching professor of finance in the Finance and Law Department in the College of Business Administration at the University of Missouri St. Louis. He serves on the boards of the Bander Center, Master Clock, which is a global timing systems company, and Schaefer Manufacturing, an international lubricants manufacturer. Mike has had a long career as a corporate executive and a lawyer, and he is here to introduce our first speaker. So thank you, Michael.
Good morning. I'm going to admit right up front, I'm probably the least qualified person here in the audience, and therefore I'm going to depend on most of you to guide me through our discussions today. We hope to have a more discussion-oriented as opposed to a strictly Q&A. So it's my pleasure to introduce to you our first presenter, and that's David Karandish. And I think it's an interesting way to open it with someone who is exploring how we're going to use this, how we're going to create the tools that are going to drive this forward. David is a co-founder and CEO of Capacity, an enterprise artificial SaaS company. In fact, it furnished a customer service tool for a company of which I am associated. He's a serial entrepreneur of companies such as Answers.com and AI Jane. He serves on the Forbes Technology Council and serves communities and not-for-profits such as Varsity Tutors and Create a Loop, which teaches kids to code and prepare AI, providing educational resources about artificial intelligence. David has a BS in computer science from Washington University of St. Louis. Would you please welcome David?
How's everybody doing this morning? Excellent. We're going to try to make this as entertaining as possible and informative. Usually if you get one out of a presentation, you're in good shape, but we'll try to hit on both today. So as mentioned, I'm David Karandish, CEO and co-founder of Capacity. I'm a serial entrepreneur. Super excited to share with you kind of my perspective on the AI space. Today we're going to cover three things. First, we're going to talk about the problem that's plaguing the workplace. And this applies to healthcare, but it actually applies out to just about every industry under the sun. Second, we're going to talk about the solution. How do we come in and solve this big problem? What does that look like? And then third, we're going to spend a few moments talking about how this specifically applies to the healthcare field, going through the different personas that this can affect. We ready to jump in? All right. I like the enthusiasm. All right, so let's start out with the problem. There is a huge expectation gap in the workplace between how we believe things should work and how things actually work. Now, do we have anyone in the audience, any parents in the audience, right? So if you ever buy one of these baby Bjorns, right, you see the picture, and it looks something like this. It's all very neatly snuggled. But then you try to go to assemble that baby Bjorn, and it's something like this, right? I have 4 kids, so I'm just happy if the baby's upright. Or any Bob Ross fans? Anybody, back in the day, right? Chia Pets, 90s favorite commercials, and it ends up looking a lot more like that. Or my personal favorite, who here is on Instagram? Any Instagrammers? Only a few admitted Instagrammers. I think there are a lot of hidden Instagrammers in the room. You have that desire for that great, iconic shot, right? And then it ends up looking more like a sea creature has grabbed your face. Now, the reason I bring this up is that this sentiment is what it feels like to be in the modern workplace. We have our expectations for what things should be like, and then we're faced with reality that looks more like the picture on the right. This is exemplified by a recent stat we saw from, I believe this was from Knowledge Management World. They were talking about how in 99% of organizations, people want access to their healthcare benefits outside of their normal 9 to 5. So if you want to know, what's covered on our health plan, We might have that question at 11 o'clock at night when your kid is up sneezing or whatever, probably because they fell out of the baby Bjorn. But in fact, in most workplaces, only 12% of companies can actually provide that information for you outside of the workday. So big gap between almost 100% of us want this information, only 12% of companies can provide it. So it feels like we've put up a maze in front of the average team member. We've actually made it more difficult to transact and to engage. So we've got 3 Ds we're going to talk about today that describe this problem. The discovery problem, the digestion problem, and the ditto problem. So we'll unpack these over the next few minutes. So let's go through a couple of stats on this. So Inc. Put out a stat recently that said we are wasting about 22 hours a week looking for information internally. There was a recent Medium article that talked about how almost every intranet needs to be torn down and rebuilt from the ground up. And I really like this quote from the folks at Prescient Media. When employees can't find the information they need to do their job, they become frustrated, which impacts overall engagement. The digestion problem is that it is difficult to consume the information we need to be effective. Forget finding it. Even if we have it, it's difficult to digest it. So the average millennial or Gen Zer gets somewhere between 75 to 128 texts per day. So if you're wondering what's happening with your team members, why they seem distracted, it's because they have 100 pings that are happening to their phone every single day. Reading is down 30% in terms of just time spent reading as overall time consuming media. And the average, to put this into numbers, the average employee handbook is 49 pages long. And so if you think about the gap between reading a 128-character text and going through an average handbook, let alone one in the healthcare space, you have a big gap in terms of expectations. I saw this most pronounced recently with an organization we're working with. This particular organization, when they bring on a new team member, that team member receives a 267-page onboarding guide. Now that's just to log into their key systems. That's not their policies, that's not their procedures, it's not their regs. That's literally a 267-page onboarding guide for how to log into their systems. True story. Now, the worst part of this story is that not only is this thing gargantuan, you have to read through a small novella every time you join, but they actually hand you a physical binder with this information printed out. There's a small Amazonian forest that gets chopped down every time someone joins this particular organization. This is what we deal with in the workplace. All right, we covered the discovery problem, we covered the digestion problem. Let's talk about what I like to call the ditto problem. The ditto problem is that we waste a lot of time with frustratingly repetitive tasks. Information Age put out a whole stat on how 90% of workers are burdened with boring and repetitive tasks. I would say in the healthcare and financial services spaces, that is probably asymptoting close to 100. And again, Knowledge Management World put out another stat around how 35% of our time is spent on administrative tasks, even in non-administrative functions. So you see this pattern emerging. So what's the solution? The solution to these problems is artificial intelligence. Now, everyone likes to talk about AI. I tend to find people fall into 2 buckets. Bucket A, people who think AI is going to read their mind the next day, and if it doesn't do that, it hasn't lived up to the media hype. And then bucket B, you've got folks who've watched one too many Terminator movies, and they're afraid that the AI is going to take over, and Skynet's going to be after them. My definition of AI is simply software that learns to replicate intelligent human behavior. I'm going to repeat that. Artificial intelligence is software that learns to replicate intelligent human behavior. Now, I'm going to point out a couple things. I know a lot of non-intelligent human behavior that it could replicate. We're not going to talk about that today. But our bar for what is AI continues to move. The classic quote, any sufficiently advanced technology can be perceived as magic. If we would have gone back 50 years and shown someone Google Maps, they would have thought this was the most amazing thing in the world. Compared to today, if Google Maps told me to take Highway 40 instead of Lindell and it added 2 extra minutes to my drive this morning, I'm like, this technology just doesn't work. So our expectations continue to move in replicating this intelligent human behavior. Now, artificial intelligence is aided by a sister technology that is, I would view as a subset of AI itself, called machine learning. Machine learning is a subset of AI where computer programs are learning to adapt to new data without human interference. David, what in the world does that mean? So let's use an example. From the real estate world. If we were going to try to model out an algorithm to predict home prices, we could go in and we could say, let's look at the zip code, let's look at the square footage of the home, let's look at the square footage of the lot, how many bedrooms, how many bathrooms, is it a single-story home, is it a two-story home? And you could use that information to start to predict what a home's price is going to be worth. And you'd get a good overall predictor, but not something that you'd want to go and replace your Realtor or Zillow with tomorrow, because it wouldn't be accurate enough. So typical statistical methods would say, how many new variables can we add into the mix to help refine our models? Machine learning would go through and say, instead of you, the analyst, assigning weights to those individual variables, we're going to automatically figure out which variables make sense under various conditions. So for example, being in a cul-de-sac may give you a plus 5% on the price of your home, unless you're located next to a nuclear power plant, in which case the glow of the home's paint may be overshadowed by the glow that you get being too close to the nuclear plant. So think of machine learning as the ability to have the machine or the algorithm determine which variables are actually important, and even suggest the scenarios in which those variables are important. We can go through more details on some of the ways machine learning gets applied in a little bit. Now, about 80% of enterprises are using AI in some form or fashion. A lot of times this technology lives behind the scenes. So if you think about how we use it in the consumer world, I mentioned my Google Map example. Anyone here use Gmail? Probably many of you. Have you seen the Gmail autocomplete, where they will start auto-completing your message as you type it? This uses machine learning to predict what you are likely to type based on what billions of other people have typed in. If you've ever used photo stabilization on your phone, machine learning and AI are used to do auto-cropping and to use multiple lenses to create a better picture. And then in the consumer world, anyone here a fan of Stranger Things? Anybody? If you're not watching Stranger Things, you're really missing out. So Netflix is smart enough to know that I'm really into sci-fi. I know that's hard to believe. And so instead of showing me old episodes of Friends, it's used its machine learning algorithm to come back and say, David is likely to like this particular genre, this particular type of entertainment. So all this is applied in our consumer world, and we're now starting to go take this technology and not just apply it at home, we're starting to apply it at work. And in fact, a lot of people have talked about how this technology is poised to take a lot of jobs. And it's true that there are going to be many jobs that change because of this technology. But in fact, there are about 58 million jobs that are going to be created because of this technology. 58 million jobs. And that's not by like 2082 or 2052. It's by 2022. Now, if I did my John Nash squint, I'd be looking at myself and I'd be saying, David, everybody isn't going to be a developer. Everyone isn't going to be coding. How could almost 60 million jobs appear by 2022 with this technology? I'm glad you asked. Well, part of the drive behind this technology, it's not just the computer scientists. It's the data scientists who are analyzing the results of the AI. It's the data labelers who are going in and training data sets. So you think about, let's use an example near and dear to this world. You think about all the medical billing and coding jobs that are up for automation, that are going to be potentially automated out of the field. A lot of those jobs are going to disappear, but they're going to be replaced by medical labeling and training jobs for people who are labeling and training data sets for the AIs to go improve upon. And so I do think that there are going to be jobs that are lost, but there are going to be just as many jobs and possibly more created by this technology. Now, there will always be some folks that get caught in the middle. So one of the biggest jump in search term volume, query volume recently is this term called reskilling. So reskilling is the process of taking someone who used to be in one field, giving them new economy types of skills, often of which have a technology or AI component. You can see here from Google Trends, in recent times this has skyrocketed in terms of people looking at reskilling as something they're going to have to do if you're mid-career. Now, I'm born and raised here in Missouri, and we happen to be the show me state. So I can sit here and I can preach about AI all morning long, but I thought what I'd do is I'd like to walk you through 3 examples of how we're applying AI directly in the world of natural language processing and helping people access information. So I'm going to start with my friends at Total Access Urgent Care. So Doc came to us and they said, David, we've got 2 problems. Problem number 1 is that we're getting calls coming into our clinics, and a lot of these calls are for basic information. Where's the Big Bend location? What are your hours? Do you guys perform this particular procedure? And that's fine to get those calls, and there will always be someone there to answer those calls. But at peak times, that phone line could get backed up to the point where they may even have physicians answering calls. Now, my wife is a former physician, and if there's one thing you don't want physicians doing, it's answering the phones. And so they looked at this and they said, something is no bueno here. There has to be a better way to go deflect these calls. So they came in and they brought our company capacity into Total Access Urgent Care, and we deployed a very straightforward chatbot on their website. We're able to now deflect about 20% of the patient calls without dropping patient volume, by the way, because they don't want to do that. And it's a very straightforward use case. However, it's not just applied from a customer perspective. Talk has, I think, about 18 locations in the St. Louis area, and one of the things that they asked us for is they want to be able to ask questions as a physician who may rotate between different locations around where are the rubber gloves in location A? Do we perform this procedure in location B? And so not only is Total Access Urgent Care using this from a customer or patient-facing perspective, they're also using this kind of technology to help their physicians be better. All right, I want to talk about a non-healthcare example, but we'll loop around on how this can apply. So TD Ameritrade came to us and said, David, we've got this big problem. And our problem is that we acquired Scottrade, minor multi-billion-dollar acquisition, but a lot of our talent is left. Good, bad, ugly, they're no longer here. So if we want to find out who the experts are in our legacy projects, it's really difficult to do that. So if you want to know who can help me with the Oracle migration project, answering that question is not a trivial task within TD Ameritrade. So they came to us and said, David, we want to reduce the time it takes to find these internal experts. So we looked at it and we said, okay, how do we define an internal expert? So we got a hold of 2 important data sources, one formal and one informal. The formal data source that we were able to connect to was their Jira ticketing history. So Atlassian makes this product Jira. It's a ticketing platform where the TD Ameritrade dev folks would put in the tickets that they responded to. So we were able to spider that information and figure out who has answered tickets, who's responded to tickets, who's completed tickets across these various topics. But the second, possibly more interesting data source was their Slack repository. Slack is an instant messaging platform similar to Skype or Microsoft Teams. We were able to get a hold of any of the public channel conversations that people had. And we were able to map out who knew what in the organization based on how they responded to these Slack instant messages. So with a combination of the ticketing data and the Slack instant messages, we're now able to help answer that question and get them to an expert in just under 4 seconds. This could have taken, in many cases, weeks to find internally. And the best part is that we had them build a hand-built model for who these experts were, and we agreed with their hand-built model somewhere between 8 and 9 times out of 10. And in fact, the times when we didn't agree, we actually surfaced people that they're like, oh yeah, we should be talking with them. Third one, let's talk about the folks at AllianceBernstein. So AllianceBernstein is one of the largest asset managers in the world. And they've got a problem where their sales prospectus sheets have lots of information. So if you're one of these hard-charging, alpha-driving salespeople, you want to know what was the 3-year performance on the AB income fund. So they came to us and said, David, we want real-time prospectus data information in the hands of our sales team without having to go dive through all of these different PDFs and documents. I'm sure you all never spend any time looking at PDFs and documents to find information. I'm sure that never, ever happens, right? So we went through and we were able to mine the information out of those documents. And in this case, we actually created what we call a live sheet. A live sheet is where we pull information out of a bunch of documents, place it into a cloud-enabled spreadsheet, either Excel 365 or Google Sheets. And we've connected Capacity to that live sheet so you could ask your question. Capacity will go into that spreadsheet, pull the answer out, and come back to you instantly. They now have access to over 50,000 data points in just a couple of seconds. Now, I want to point out something that a lot of the folks in the AI world don't like to talk about. Everyone likes to get up here and talk about how amazing their AI is, how amazing their natural language processing works. But what we found is that the AI is only a part of the solution. Similar to, you think about the overall patient experience in a clinical setting, getting your arm fixed when your arm was broken, that's important. But there are other parts that have a big component of that patient experience, whether the wait time, the price of the procedure, how the insurance paperwork went, if you want an overall satisfaction to increase. Similarly, in the world I work out of, the AI is very important, but the overall customer experience is just as important. So using this example with AllianceBernstein, AllianceBernstein has 20 different AB income funds. So if we just came back to them with an instant response and picked one of those funds, that wouldn't be a great user experience. So we took a page out of what people do, and we've implemented what we call a clarifier, where if you ask Capacity a question and it needs some follow-up information, it'll come back and say, oh, did you mean A, B, or C? And the best part is that as more and more people select option B, Capacity learns that information over time and can start to canonicalize that experience. So it's both taking a page out of the human experience of how people interact, as well as using machine learning to make it so that you don't have to clarify as often down the road. Ultimately, this technology is all about making you the hero. I mentioned that a lot of AI companies are out touting this idea that they're going to go in and automate all of the workplace. I think that's bananas. I think that there is a huge opportunity to automate key pieces of the workplace that aren't great fits for human tasks, like looking up information, like repeating things over and over again. There will always be a human component. And in fact, any AI vendor who comes up and doesn't make you, the organization, the hero, I think is doing you all a disservice. So let's do a little dive into healthcare specifically. David, how is this technology changing the way that healthcare works? And again, in the world of AI, I happen to be in the subfield around natural language processing, document mining, machine learning research around classification of text, clarification of text. But I'm going to talk here a little more broadly about AI applying to the healthcare space in general. So we're going to go through 5 personas that are and will continue to be using AI technology. First, let's start with the patient persona. So I mentioned earlier how the patient experience is much bigger than the actual medical care provided. Right? The health care and medical care are not 100% synonymous. So I can think of a recent example. My wife was at the hospital, just gave birth to one of my 4 kids, and I needed to come back for something, and I could not navigate my way around MOBAP. Maybe I spent too much time working on AI problems, but just trying to find the room was very painful. We talked about earlier with total access urgent care, just trying to understand, when are these guys open? It's 10 o'clock at night. Do I need to go to the hospital? Do I need to wait till tomorrow? Or can I find a place that's open today? A lot of people want to jump to an automated system that's going to have all of your patient healthcare records available and instantly pair you up with a personalized medicine experience. And I'm all for that, right? I'm not a one-size-fits-all kind of person. But I don't think that's where we're going to start. I think we're going to start by fixing, where do I park at BJC? We're going to fix it by answering questions like, what hours is this particular location open? We're going to fix the patient experience by answering questions like, what insurance do you take? Without having to have this awkward conversation with somebody behind the desk. My daughter recently fell off the monkey bars, and we went to an urgent care facility, and they literally could not tell me how much the procedure was going to cost. I'm like, what do you mean? They're like, we can't give you that information. Like, well, what do you mean? They're like, well, we got to go through this insurance process, and we got to do this and that, and what your copay will be. It was baffling, right? And so I think you're going to see this patient experience change first with all of the things that are outside of the actual medical care. Let's talk about research. My wife is, like I mentioned, she's a physician by training, gastroenterologist. I like to say she's good with a camera. That's my one GI joke. Think about that for a minute. But one of the things that was very frustrating to her when she was doing her research work was that collaborating with other people who are working on similar problems was very difficult. If you wanted to find who was researching one particular subfield within the world of GI, answering that question is actually really hard. You can find people who are doing overall research, but the ability to collaborate with other researchers was very hampered. I believe that in an AI-powered research environment, you're not just going to find people who are looking into Crohn's disease, but you're going to be able to classify the subproblem all the way down to a very, very specific population. Said another way, the best researchers going forward are not just the people who have the best ideas or the hardest working. They're going to be the people who know how to use the AI-powered tools to enable them to complete their research and collaborate with others. We'll talk about got 2 minutes? 2 minutes, okay. Talk about the clinical environment. A lot of folks have talked about how physicians are going to get replaced by some of this technology. I think that we're going to see medical imaging as a combination of people plus humans to lead us to better outcomes. You've already seen some of that happen with certain detection of cancers. I've got more time. We can talk about that in the panel. Government regs, you're going to see us in a spot where trying to decipher the very Byzantine regulations that the government puts out around certain types of medical areas. You're going to see AI help parse through that. I actually believe that governments will start to adopt this technology to help people navigate the system. And then finally, insurance, last persona. You think about all the errors that happen in translating paperwork from paperwork to paperwork. You're going to see first the digitization of this information, where physical paperwork becomes less and less. But secondly, you're going to see the automation of that digitization, where you put the information in once and it intelligently populates across multiple forms and procedures. One of the worst experiences you can have is filling out a form and then having to fill 90% of the same information out again. So just to recap, we talked about the problem, big expectation gap we have in the workplace. We talked about AI, the solution to solving the problem. And we talked about how this is going to affect healthcare directly. Thank you.
Is there anyone that wants to ask a question before I get started? David, one of the things that, as a board member, when you come in to sell, how long does it take for management to even understand what the expectation should be? You talk about unrealistic expectations. How do you deal with that?
Yeah, so from an expectation standpoint, I mentioned those two poles, the Terminator people and the read my mind people. What we've found is that the best implementations that we have are when the team has a clear goal in mind in terms of what they want to automate. So I'll give you an example of this. We recently signed, I think, the fourth or fifth largest mortgage institution in the United States. And they came in and they said, we have a very specific problem where we have this regulatory information and we cannot continue fielding the manual questions that come out of our regs. There was a very clearly defined problem. They had a clearly defined pain point that they could actually tie real dollars to. And they came back to us and said, David, if you can reduce the number of inbound calls, emails, interruptions that go to my support center, then this is a very easy to justify type of investment. On the flip side, we had another client who came to us and said, oh, we're adopting this new messaging platform. We want you to put capacity in that messaging platform and make it be the help center for that messaging platform. Well, it turns out that only 10% of that client actually rolled out that messaging platform and used it on a day-to-day basis. And so even though they had a great example for what they wanted to solve, if you deploy in an interface that nobody is using, you don't get the intended results.
And how is the integration of those interfaces? I know in one company they had the data, but then they tried to pair it with Skype, and that didn't work very well. What are the things holding back collaboration between the platforms?
Yeah, so one of the things we've discovered is that the interface is very important in terms of the types of results you can get. So if I jumped in my DeLorean and I went back, if I'm driving like this, I'm not going to go back in time. But if I jumped in my DeLorean and I went back in time 2.5 years ago, our initial thesis was that we wanted to deploy capacity in the existing chat interfaces companies are using, like Skype, like Slack, like Microsoft Teams. But one of the things we realized as we went along was that, A, the chat adoption isn't as high as we thought it would be. But B, maybe more important, is that those interfaces, much like Alexa and Siri, do a bad job of previewing what's possible back to the user. We ended up launching our own, what we call our web concierge, what you can put on your website or on your intranet, where as you start typing, we will show you the types of questions that capacity can answer. By doing that one little tiny user experience tweak, we were able to get a big jump in our match rate because you don't have to try to understand what the AI can do. You don't have to know the syntax. You can actually understand and discover what's possible even as you type without having to submit each query at a time. So when I think about the three sources where your company intelligence lives, I would boil it down to to really three key places. Your information is scattered across your apps, it's buried inside of your documents, and it's uncaptured in the minds of your team. So kind of apps, docs, people are the three places that you want to plug into if you want to be able to access your company intelligence. So let's go through each of those. In the last 2.5 years, we've built out about 50 different app integrations with a lot of the common platforms that you'd expect. So Office 365 and NetSuite and Salesforce and these types of things. The first time we wanted to connect to any of those apps, it was like one of those circus performances going around and trying to figure out what we could do. Now, if you're like, hey, I use these fairly common cloud-based platforms, we can turn those on with the flick of a switch. So initially, our team built all of those app integrations. We've just now recently released our developer platform, where now we can open it up and say, look, if you've got some kind of proprietary app that we're not the experts in, you can go build that connection out. But if you're using one of these off-the-shelf apps, we can get those up and running quickly. So I would say the app part of self-service, if you will, is moving very fast. Let's talk about documents. So initially, when we started doing integrations with documents, companies would send us their docs. We'd go through and manually convert them into questions and answers and put those answers into our knowledge base. As you can imagine, there were two big problems with that. Well, three big problems with that. One, it was very time-consuming, so that isn't great to do. Two, we now had a copy of that information, so if that original document got updated, it was now in two separate places. And then three, managing that process between what's in the doc and what's in the Q&A was just very messy. Fast forward to where we're at today with the work of Dave Castanero, who's here in the room on our AI team and our BI team. We've submitted a patent around the ability to automatically extract questions and answers out of a document. Now, it's not perfect technology yet. We still have a long way to go. But we are moving toward a world where you upload your documents into our cloud drive. We automatically extract the questions and answers out of that document so that you don't have to go through and do that manual work. Now, let's talk about the tacit knowledge piece. I would say this is the longest pole in the tent to automate, because tacit knowledge can be distributed across multiple systems. So to the extent that you're using a ticketing platform, a messaging platform, or your corporate email policy allows emails to be ingested, those are great places where we can build that tacit knowledge right off the bat. A lot of organizations, you can't do that for a variety of reasons. In that case, we have to build that tacit knowledge with usage, and so that just takes time to build out over the course of the implementation. So I'd say apps, we're getting to be very self-serve. Documents are next on the list. Tacit knowledge after that.
Next up in that question?
The question has to do with, tacit knowledge is perfect. So you've got these little systems going in, they're layering across everything, and they're extracting that tacit knowledge, right? Mm-hmm. The human beings sort of like let go, and they're like, it does it. How do you avoid like path dependence or ruts or, I feel like the AI is going to do it a certain way, right? But you might, how do you check in and refresh?
Yeah, great question. So there are a couple different ways we do that. Starting from the very top, when most NLP-based AIs fail, it's almost always not because they provided you with the wrong answer. It's usually because they matched to the wrong question and interpreted your question, gave you the right answer to the wrong question. So the first thing that we do is anytime you ask a question to our capacity bot, if it's not an exact match, we will actually mirror back to the user and say, this is what we thought you matched to. So using a HR example, if I asked about the maternity policy and it somehow, in some way, matched to the military policy, we need to tell you that. We need to indicate that. So the first thing that we want to do is we want to give you the insights into what we thought you meant. Second thing that we do is we provide a feedback mechanism with every single response. So it's a very simple thumbs up, thumbs down. If you thumb up the response, we will match to that a little more often. If you thumb that down, you can provide a feedback reason for it. We escalate that up from that level 0 support up to level 1. Now, in the cases where the match was great, but the information was just off for some reason, we have a couple ways that we tackle that. The first is that, does anybody ever remember Inspector Gadget? Anybody ever watched Inspector Gadget as a kid, right? Well, at the end, there was always a message that would self-destruct in 3 seconds or whatever. Well, similarly, most knowledge bases were designed to treat all of your information as if it was evergreen, to treat it all as if it's always going to be good forever. We actually strongly recommend our clients to not make everything evergreen and set an expiration date for every piece of knowledge in the system. And the way that we've designed the system is we can actually notify you when something is coming up for expiration, so you can go snooze it and say, no, actually this is still good, or say, oh yeah, you're right, that policy is out of date, that policy is no longer the right answer. The next way that we treat this problem is that sometimes you might have two conflicting sources of information, right? Not just what you match to, but where did the information come from? So if you had asked a question and you got two responses back, one came from the 2009 policy and one came from the 2019 policy, we can actually show the source of where that response came from. So you know that the 2019 policy is where you need to look, and you can thumb down the 2009 policy. So those are just a couple of the ways that we tackle that problem.
We're almost at time, but I wanted to build on that question. My name's Catherine Matthews. In terms of bias, so I work a lot in the equity space, and we know that as humans, we have implicit bias. So is that bias, especially in healthcare, is reflected in systematic decision making? How do we keep an eye out for that?
Yeah, great question. So machine learning models are only as good as the data in which they're trained on. So if we trained a model that said people who are 6'3", with curly hair tend to commit a lot of crimes, and I went in to that data model, it could falsely say, oh, this could be a predicted criminal. Or if we have a data set that it's very limited and not representative of the population, you can get the AI to produce results that are not where you'd want them to be at. So that the very first thing that we like to do is we like to delineate the data sets. You've got some data sets that are providing existing information that's just hard to get to. In that case, you don't have to worry as much about the bias. Then you've got data sets that are meant to make a decision on, in which case you really have to drill in on what the population is that you're both trying to serve and the population from which the data set was built on.
With that, I'd like to thank David for his time. I hope you enjoyed his presentation, and we thank you very much for being here.
Thanks for having me.
Good job, thank you.
Yeah, appreciate it.